The year is 1859. Fog lies heavy over the valley of Ashford Hollow, a small settlement in rural Pennsylvania. By daylight, it looked like any other frontier community. A church steeple, scattered farmhouses, children chasing each other through fields. But when the sun dipped behind the ridges, something else took hold. Families barred their doors. Windows were shuttered, and not a single lamp flickered in the streets. They weren't hiding from thieves. They weren't hiding from wolves. They were hiding from their own history, a truth so monstrous it was easier to pretend it never happened. Welcome to Unseen Rite, where we uncover the stories that were never meant to see the light. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these dark historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our viewers across America. It begins with the sound of weeping. The journals say it carried across the hills on certain nights, echoing from beneath the abandoned infirmary at the heart of the settlement. The building had been sealed for years, its windows bricked, its doors chained. But those who lived closest swore they could hear children sobbing, muffled prayers, and the scrape of metal on stone. Some dismissed it as the groans of an old foundation. Others knew better, because Ashford Hollow had been built on a promise of healing, and what followed was closer to ritual sacrifice disguised as medicine. The man who brought them here was celebrated in his time, Dr. Elias Harrow, a physician trained in Philadelphia, a preacher of what he called scientific salvation. He told desperate families that blood carried more than disease. It carried memory, weakness, and the sins of their ancestors. And only by purging bloodlines through controlled breeding and medical interventions could mankind be reborn. For a time, his words felt like hope. Parents brought their sick children to him, convinced he could rewrite their fate. What they didn't know was that Harrow's experiments were never about curing illness. They were about control. He wanted to prove that memory itself could be erased, rewritten and reshaped inside the body. What better way to hide his work than in a valley no one would think to search? Ashford Hollow did not vanish overnight. It rotted, and as the years passed, its secret became more dangerous. Because the experiments of Elias Harrow may not have ended when the town fell silent. The first records of Dr. Harrow's methods are not found in medical journals, but in private letters hidden inside the false floorboards of a farmhouse. They speak of treatments that began with ordinary remedies, herbal tinctures, bleeding cups, and lectures on morality. But as the months passed, his patients were drawn deeper into a system of rituals. Each step was designed to convince them that sickness was not an accident of nature, but a curse written into their very lineage. Harrow told parents that their children's suffering came not from infection, but from memory. He believed that memories pass through blood the way voices echo through stone, and he believed he could cut those memories out. At first, families resisted, but when the first child who entered his infirmary walked again after months of paralysis, the resistance collapsed. Whether that recovery was coincidence, fabrication, or manipulation, we will never know. What we do know is that it was enough to make the people of Ashford Hollow believe he held power. That belief gave him permission to escalate. Surgeries were performed in the dead of night, without anesthesia, with parents ordered to remain silent outside locked doors. If they wept, they were told their grief would poison the treatment. And if a child did not return alive, Harrow would claim the disease had already consumed them, too far gone for salvation. The families accepted these losses because to question him was to admit they had allowed monsters into their homes. Silence became survival. But silence does not erase truth. Some of those who survived his interventions began to change in ways no one could explain. They awoke without memories of their parents, unable to recall their own names. Others developed violent fits, lashing out at siblings as if driven by voices no one else could hear. One girl was said to recite entire passages of medical texts in Latin, though she had never been taught a single word of the language. By 1861, Ashford Hollow was no longer a town of families. It was a living laboratory. Children born there were considered property of Harrow's doctrine, marked for procedures before they could even speak. Records suggest he began pairing couples not by affection, but by genetic calculation, forcing unions designed to test whether he could engineer memory itself. And yet in the background of these experiments, a darker possibility began to surface. What if Harrow wasn't only trying to erase memory, but to implant his own? The earliest whispers of implanted memory came from a boy named Samuel Kettering. He was 8 years old, frail, with a chronic cough that kept him bedridden. His parents agreed to let Harrow cleanse him, believing it would restore strength. Samuel survived the procedure, but when he awoke, something was wrong. He no longer recognized his family. He spoke with a cadence that did not belong to a child, quoting sermons almost word for word from Elias Harrow's own lectures. When questioned, he insisted he was not Samuel at all. He said he was Elias. At first the parents thought this was delirium, a fever dream from the shock of surgery. But the more they listened, the more frightened they became. The boy described events from Harrow's past, specific cases from his days in Philadelphia, names of patients he had studied, even mistakes in diagnosis that Harrow had hidden. It was impossible for a child to know these things. The parents went to Harrow in fear, demanding answers. His reply was chilling in its simplicity. He told them they should rejoice. Their son had been saved, purified of weakness, reborn with a greater mind. This was the moment Ashford Hollow crossed the line from medicine into possession. Families began noticing other children behaving strangely, their voices dropping, their mannerisms shifting. It was as if Harrow was multiplying himself through the young, planting fragments of his own will in their minds. Was it hypnosis? Was it suggestion, whispered during fevered states? Or had he truly found a way to overwrite memory with something foreign? Whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. By 1862, people whispered that the town itself was no longer theirs. The children who had once filled the fields with laughter were now shadows of themselves. Some sat for hours staring at the infirmary, awaiting instruction. Others refused to answer to their given names, claiming those names had been stripped away. One boy went missing for 3 days, only to be found in the woods, carving symbols into trees that matched diagrams Harrow sketched in his journals. And yet, despite mounting dread, the family stayed. They stayed because leaving meant admitting they had surrendered their children to something unnatural. They stayed because Harrow convinced them that the outside world would never believe them, that to speak was to invite ruin. And so Ashford Hollow sank deeper into silence. But silence cannot contain corruption forever. The silence of Ashford Hollow began to fracture when Charlotte Weaver, a midwife, stumbled upon Harrow's hidden records. She had been called to assist with a birth. But what she found in the infirmary cellar shook her to the core. Beneath the floorboards, in jars of murky fluid, floated fragments of tissue, organs, even small malformed skulls, catalogued with neat handwriting. Each specimen was labeled not by name, but by number, with notes detailing procedures: extraction, transfusion, implantation. It was not the work of a physician trying to heal. It was the work of a man attempting to reassemble humanity piece by piece. Charlotte confided in one of the mothers, but fear strangled any thought of rebellion. Families told her not to speak, not to spread panic. They whispered that Harrow's reach extended beyond the Hollow, that wealthy men from Philadelphia and Washington occasionally visited the infirmary. Under the cover of night, these visitors never stayed long, but they always left with locked trunks and sealed packages. Some claimed Harrow was not working alone, that he was part of something larger, an institution that needed his results to justify a new kind of power. The midwife, however, could not stay silent. She began documenting what she saw in coded entries, hiding her pages inside the lining of her skirts. She wrote about children waking with strange scars behind their ears, as though something had been inserted or removed. She described the way their eyes changed, growing unnervingly still, as if thought itself had been shackled, and she noticed one detail that would later haunt investigators. Harrow's experiments always seemed to focus on memory, but never on his own. He kept immaculate journals, but nothing personal. It was as if he feared his own mind might one day be stolen back from him. By 1863, whispers spread beyond the valley. Travelers passing through spoke of children at Ashford Hollow, who answered questions in voices not their own, who moved with eerie precision like actors repeating a script. Word reached nearby towns, but every attempt to confront Harrow was smothered. He carried letters of protection from officials whose names carried weight. To accuse him was to risk being branded a liar or worse, a traitor to progress. Still, Charlotte persisted. She believed the only way to stop him was to bring his secrets into the open. But exposing forbidden knowledge comes with a price, and in Ashford Hollow that price was always paid in blood. The price was exacted one storm-lashed night in October 1863. The valley shook with thunder, but those in the Weaver household swore the real sound that tore through the hollow was not from the sky. It was a scream, sharp, short, and cut off too quickly. Charlotte Weaver never returned home. Her neighbors found the front door ajar, a lantern overturned, and her notes scattered across the floor as if someone had rifled through them in haste. Her body was never recovered. Whispers spread that Harrow had silenced her, though no proof ever surfaced. In the weeks after, the town entered a new phase of fear. Mothers held their children tighter, yet those children seemed more distant with each passing day, their minds slipping further from them. It was as though Harrow had tightened his grip in response to Charlotte's defiance. Families who once thought of fleeing now locked themselves deeper into compliance. He had shown them the cost of resistance. But Charlotte's work was not lost. Before her disappearance, she had entrusted fragments of her notes to a traveling merchant named Silas Crane. Silas was a drifter, a man who traded in tobacco, glass, and gossip. He was no saint, but he was sharp enough to recognize the value of what he held. When he read her coded pages, he realized they were not just observations, but instructions. Descriptions of Harrow's methods written with surgical precision. Silas carried these papers beyond the valley, selling them to men who dealt in secrets, and in doing so, he spread Harrow's doctrine farther than the doctor himself ever could. If Harrow had dreamed of multiplying his ideas, Charlotte's stolen notes became the perfect seed. In cities far from Ashford Hollow, whispers began of memory grafting, of experiments that could shape the mind as one shapes clay. Most dismissed it as rumor, but some listened, and some paid dearly for the details. Meanwhile, inside the valley, the children grew stranger. A boy named Jonathan, only 12, stopped speaking altogether, communicating instead by scratching diagrams into the dirt that matched Harrow's own medical sketches. A young girl began reciting phrases of languages she could not know, words her mother later identified as fragments of ancient prayers. The line between what was human and what was Harrow blurred more with each experiment. And through it all, Elias Harrow himself seemed untouched by time. Witnesses remarked that he looked no older in 1863 than he had in 1859, almost as if his experiments had preserved more than memory. By the winter of 1864, the illusion of ordinary life in Ashford Hollow had collapsed. The settlement no longer felt like a town but a stage, every family forced into roles they had not chosen. The church bells still rang on Sundays, yet the sermons sounded eerily like Harrow's lectures, spoken through the mouths of children who no longer remembered their own prayers. What had once been faith was now repetition. And then came the incident with the mirrors. Families began covering reflective glass after a series of strange accounts. Children would sit for hours, staring at their reflections, whispering words no one else could understand. Some claimed they saw not themselves, but Harrow's face gazing back at them, mouthing instructions. One father, desperate and broken, smashed every mirror in his house. That night, his son vanished. The boy was found 2 days later in the infirmary cellar, sitting calmly beside Harrow, who declared that the child had returned to his proper station. It was then the townspeople realized the full weight of their captivity. Harrow did not need chains. He had found something stronger than iron, control of memory, the rewriting of identity. And with every passing day, fewer in the valley could recall what life had been before him. Whole families woke to discover their children no longer remembered their names. Others swore they had lost pieces of their own past, as though their memories had been siphoned away in the night. Yet one figure stood against the tide. Eleanor Kettering, mother of Samuel, the boy who had first awoken claiming to be Harrow. Eleanor never accepted the transformation of her son. She wrote letters by candlelight, smuggling them to travelers, begging them to tell her story beyond the valley. In her words, she described the children as vessels emptied and filled with another man's voice. She begged for someone, anyone, to come and witness what had been done. But the letters were intercepted. Some burned before reaching their destination, others delivered directly into Harrow's hands, and yet one escaped. Decades later, it would resurface in a private collection, its paper brittle, its ink faded, but its warning unmistakable. He is making copies of himself. The hollow is a hive, and we are the cells. By then, Eleanor had vanished like Charlotte before her. Her neighbors claimed she wandered into the woods one night, chasing whispers that only she could hear. She was never seen again. The disappearances became more frequent after Eleanor Kettering was lost to the woods. Some families awoke to find an empty bed where a child had slept. Others reported husbands or wives leaving in the middle of the night, drawn as if by unseen hands toward the infirmary. When questioned later, those who returned gave the same answer. They had no memory of leaving, no sense of time passed, only the faint recollection of Harrow's voice instructing them in their dreams. By 1865, Ashford Hollow was a place no outsider dared enter. Travelers avoided the valley entirely, telling stories of pale children watching silently from fences, of men who spoke in tones not their own, and of a doctor who seemed more like a priest officiating over rituals no church would ever sanction. The town earned a name whispered in taverns and stagecoaches, the hollow that breathes. For those who believed the tales, Ashford Hollow was not just cursed, it was alive. And then came the fire. One spring night, flames erupted in the Weaver house, the very home where Charlotte had once hidden her notes. The blaze spread quickly, consuming neighboring structures. Some claimed the fire was accidental, sparked by an overturned lamp. Others swore they saw Harrow standing calmly in the street, watching as the flames swallowed the homes of those who'd resisted him most fiercely. Strangely, the infirmary itself remained untouched, though sparks rained down upon it. Witnesses described the fire curling away from its walls, as if the building itself refused to burn. In the ashes of the Weaver home, searchers found something that did not belong, a locked iron box. Inside were scraps of parchment, scorched at the edges, but still legible. They contained diagrams of human skulls, with etched pathways linking memory to speech, emotion and obedience. At the bottom of the box was a phrase written over and over in Harrow's hand. "The vessel is nothing. The imprint is eternal." This was the first undeniable proof of his obsession, immortality through replication. If he could overwrite a child's memory with his own, he could live forever, scattered across bodies, multiplied through generations. The fire had not destroyed the truth, it had illuminated it. But even that revelation was only the beginning, because soon the children of Ashford Hollow would not just carry fragments of Harrow, they would become something entirely new. By the summer of 1866, the children of Ashford Hollow were no longer children at all. They moved with an unnatural precision, their eyes sharp and calculating. Conversations became cryptic. They repeated phrases from Harrow's lectures as if rehearsed, and occasionally one would stop mid-sentence and correct an adult as though correcting a pupil. The villagers, once desperate to protect their offspring, now lived in fear of them. Some families attempted to flee. They would leave in the dead of night, trudging through the thick fog that blanketed the valley. But the children always found them. It wasn't skill, necessarily. It was instinct, or something far darker. They returned the fugitives, frightened, bewildered, and in some cases, altered. A boy might return knowing facts about Harrow's work that no one had taught him. A girl might speak in a voice that wasn't her own, repeating conversations she could never have overheard. Rumors began spreading beyond the valley, reaching the outskirts of nearby towns. People whispered of families who had vanished entirely, leaving behind homes frozen in time. Travelers spoke of children reciting entire medical texts from memory, yet none had ever attended a school. Others claimed the children could manipulate emotions, bending adults to compliance with a mere suggestion. By 1867, Ashford Hollow was no longer a settlement. It was an incubator of Harrow's vision, a living proof of a mind extended beyond flesh. Yet for all the horror, the adults who remained were strangely compliant. They had been broken, reshaped by fear and grief. Many who protested in earlier years had vanished, taken into the infirmary, never to return. Those left whispered among themselves, sharing only half-truths, trying to remember what life had been before Harrow. But the past was slipping away. In that year, a wandering scholar named Dr. Langley arrived, curious about the valley's whispers. He attempted to record what he observed: diagrams drawn in dirt, children repeating phrases in Latin and Greek, and adults who spoke in tones devoid of emotion. He wrote of a man, Harrow, who seemed not to age, who walked among them with calm authority, and who treated memory as if it were clay to be moulded at will. Langley's journals were smuggled out of Ashford Hollow, but few believed them. The concept seemed too monstrous that a single man could overwrite generations, implant himself into the minds of children, and create a legacy that survived without his body. Even so, the warnings were clear. The Hollow was alive, and what lived there was not fully human. By 1868, Ashford Hollow had entered a state no outsider could understand. It was no longer a town, it was a machine, running on fear, obedience, and repetition. The children were the gears, turning relentlessly under Harrow's unseen hand. Adults who remained were either too broken to resist or had been conditioned to serve. They moved like shadows, speaking only when instructed, and rarely venturing beyond the Hollow's fog-bound borders. Harrow's experiments escalated. He no longer limited himself to surgery or herbs. Observers, few as they were, spoke of rituals conducted in the infirmary's basement, strange chambers where children were bound, and instruments of unknown purpose were used. Some of these children emerged with heightened perception, others with knowledge they could never have learned. One girl, barely 10, began drawing anatomical diagrams so precise that trained doctors later confirmed they were flawless. She did not know the names of the organs, she simply understood their functions instinctively. This was Harrow's ultimate goal, to create vessels that carried his intellect, his memory, his methodology. He wanted replication without mortality, influence without being physically present. Every experiment, every disappearance, every family that obeyed or failed to obey, served that end. And yet, cracks appeared in his system. Children, though altered, retained fragments of their own identity. Samuel, now 12, occasionally stopped mid-repetition and whispered words from before his transformation, words of fear, of longing, of his mother Eleanor. It was as if part of Harrow's imprint could not fully suppress what had once existed. Those brief moments of defiance were dangerous. Harrow punished such lapses with precision, ensuring that the lesson was always clear. Autonomy was a disease. Outside the valley, the world continued unaware. Ashford Hollow was a ghost, removed from society, and the journals that occasionally escaped, like Charlotte Weaver's before, were dismissed as the fanciful accounts of imaginative minds. But the truth was worse than fiction. Memory, identity, and humanity itself were being rewritten, and the experiment was still growing. And so the Hollow lived, breathing quietly beneath the mist, while the world beyond moved on, ignorant of what had been built, what had survived, and what would never truly die. The children of Ashford Hollow were not only witnesses, they were inheritors, and one day someone would emerge carrying all of Harrow's knowledge, all of his intent, and all of his power. By 1869, the patterns in Ashford Hollow were undeniable. Children moved in calculated formations, mimicking the precise steps Harrow had drilled into them. Their eyes reflected the candlelight, but behind those gazes lay something older, sharper and crueler than any child should possess. Parents could no longer claim these were their children. Even those adults who survived untouched began to speak in rhythms and phrases that mirrored Harrow's lessons. It was as if the entire town had become a single organism, functioning to perpetuate his vision. Harrow's experiments became more audacious. He tested memory beyond identity, beyond obedience. He began attempting to erase pain itself, believing that if suffering could be removed, the human mind would be infinitely malleable. Children were subjected to treatments that removed fear, then guilt, then empathy. The results were terrifying. Some emerged as calm, almost machine-like. Others turned violent, their minds snapping unpredictably under the weight of absence. Harrow documented every reaction, noting which techniques yielded compliance and which failed. An unexpected visitor arrived that summer as a traveling preacher who claimed to have heard the screams and tales of the valley. He entered Ashford Hollow with a small group of townsfolk, demanding an audience with the doctor. What they witnessed terrified them. Harrow did not greet them in anger or fear. Instead, he observed quietly as though examining a new subject. The children recited prayers not their own, but ones whispered by Harrow years before. When one of the visitors stepped forward, a boy corrected him in Latin, instructing him to kneel. The preacher fled, leaving the group shaken. Even among the residents, unease grew. Families whispered in corners, noting that the children occasionally looked beyond the hollow, as if sensing something they could not name. Samuel, the boy who once claimed to be Harrow, began showing subtle signs of independence again. His eyes darted, calculating, and at times he refused to answer questions. It was the first sign in years that the imprint was not absolute. But Harrow was patient. Every deviation, every flicker of resistance became an experiment in itself. He documented rebellion with the same meticulous care he had shown in surgery. His journals hinted at something far more insidious than replication. He sought not merely obedience, but longevity, an extension of himself that would survive death through minds already molded to carry pieces of his consciousness. Ashford Hollow was no longer a town. It was an experiment, a monument, and a warning. Identity could be stolen and humanity reshaped. By 1870, the Hollow's children were no longer unpredictable. They moved with precision, like instruments in a machine composed entirely of flesh and memory. Every action, every word was a rehearsal of Harrow's will. Conversations with outsiders became exercises in obedience. Those who came seeking answers left with confusion, their own minds burdened with unease. Something in the valley, something in the air, seemed to seep into thought itself, bending perception without visible touch. Harrow's experiments had evolved beyond the physical. He began chronicling subtle manipulations of thought, commands buried in repetition, suggestions implanted during sleep, and the layering of memory over memory until the original self was nearly impossible to recover. Children could not only recite instructions, but anticipate them, executing tasks before they were asked. It was a quiet, invisible domination. Parents began speaking less, afraid that a word could undo what little sanity remained. Samuel Kettering had grown into his role as Harrow's primary vessel. Occasionally, the flicker of his former self would break through, brief and sharp, like lightning in a clouded sky. During one incident, he stared across the fields and whispered the name of his mother, Eleanor, a name no one dared utter aloud. The moment was fleeting, Harrow intervened immediately, correcting the boy, rewriting the memory in subtle strokes that left no scars but reshaped thought entirely. Visitors who dared enter Ashford Hollow reported a quiet unease that could not be quantified. Some claimed the children's eyes followed them with knowledge that should have been impossible. Others swore they could feel their own memories shifting, fragments of fear and obedience threading into their minds without their consent. Langley's earlier warnings, dismissed by the outside world, began to feel less like fiction and more like prophecy. The adults who remained were shadows of themselves. They worked, they ate, they prayed, but their thoughts were no longer entirely their own. Harrow had learned the ultimate lesson. Control was more powerful when invisible. When memory could be rewritten, rebellion was not just difficult, it was impossible. Yet even in this valley of obedience, small cracks remained. A girl named Miriam stopped repeating phrases for days, instead humming melodies she could not explain. A boy drew symbols in the dirt that even Harrow did not recognize. For the first time, the hollow held subtle hints that the experiment might never be perfect, that even a mind meticulously molded could resist, if only in fragments. The question that haunted those who glimpsed these signs was simple and terrible. If Harrow could overwrite memory, what would remain of the human soul? By 1871, Ashford Hollow had become a place of quiet horror, invisible to the world yet thriving with the echoes of Harrow's ambitions. The children, once innocent, were now conduits of his will. They moved with the precision of thought itself, carrying knowledge no child should possess. Names, events, and instructions were recalled instantly, as though Harrow's consciousness lingered within them. Every whisper of memory was another stitch in a tapestry he alone could see. Even the adults, who had survived years of manipulation, were fractured. Conversations were carefully monitored by their own children, who would correct missteps, recall forgotten obligations, and sometimes issue silent warnings through mere glances. The valley had inverted itself. Children taught, adults obeyed, and Harrow observed with an almost divine patience. But subtle resistance began to appear. Samuel, now 14, occasionally paused mid-task, staring into the distance as if recalling fragments of another life. He would murmur a line of poetry, a name, or a memory unconnected to Harrow's will. For brief moments, the boy became himself again, only to be corrected swiftly. Harrow's notes described these lapses clinically, a symptom of imperfect imprinting. To him, it was a minor deviation, nothing that could not be corrected with time and repetition. Still, the existence of these cracks fueled whispers among the few adults brave enough to notice. They began to speculate that perhaps memory, though fragile, could resist manipulation if reinforced by emotion, attachment, or sheer will. They dared not voice these thoughts aloud. To do so risked not just their own safety, but that of the children whose minds had already been compromised. Meanwhile, Harrow's ambition grew darker. He began experimenting with methods to accelerate imprinting, combining physical procedures with psychological conditioning during sleep and controlled sensory deprivation. Each child was catalogued meticulously, labeled by susceptibility, memory retention, and obedience. Harrow was no longer merely a physician. He was an architect of consciousness, attempting to bend identity itself into his own design. Observers who later pieced together the events of Ashford Hollow would note one chilling fact: the valley's horrors were not born of cruelty alone. They were born of the belief that the human mind could be perfected, controlled, and multiplied, as if life itself were merely a laboratory experiment. And in that pursuit, Harrow had crossed a line that no one could undo. The Hollow thrived quietly, hidden from the outside world, its true nature known only to those who dared to survive within it. By 1872, Ashford Hollow had become something altogether different, a place neither fully human nor fully controlled. The children now carried not just Harrow's knowledge, but a strange echo of his personality. They spoke with his cadences, laughed with his timing, and sometimes, if a visitor was foolish enough to linger, their gaze would lock onto him as if evaluating, testing, measuring. Harrow's obsession had shifted. He no longer worried about external threats or even outright rebellion. His focus was now permanence. Could the imprint he had etched into these young minds survive his own mortality? Could his essence persist beyond flesh, carried forward in memory alone? The instruments, the charts, the surgical procedures, all were now secondary. The mind itself had become his canvas. Observers, few as they were, began to notice patterns in the children's behavior. Samuel, Miriam, and others were not just intelligent, they were adaptive. If one encountered resistance, they could modify tactics on the fly, issuing commands or correcting actions without apparent instruction. It was as if Harrow's mind was not merely replicated, it had begun to evolve, extending beyond its origin, growing in ways even he had not anticipated. This evolution brought unintended consequences. Children who once mimicked perfectly now showed subtle signs of autonomy. A boy would refuse a command briefly, testing boundaries. A girl would hum melodies unrecorded in Harrow's journals. The whispers among the adults, long stifled by fear, now had a voice, however faint. Some dared to hope that fragments of humanity, stubborn and enduring, could survive the imprint. Harrow, perceptive as ever, noticed these lapses, but instead of panic, he approached them like a scientist encountering a new variable. He documented, experimented, and refined. Each subtle rebellion became another test of control. And yet, the more he tried to dominate, the more unpredictable the results became. The hollow itself seemed to breathe differently, alive with the tension between obedience and the faint spark of independent thought. And still, the valley remained hidden. Outsiders who wandered too close reported fleeting glimpses. Children staring silently from fences, adults moving with unnatural precision, a church bell tolling when no one was inside. Some swore they heard whispered Latin phrases carried on the wind, as if the valley itself was speaking. Ashford Hollow was no longer merely a town or an experiment. It had become a living question. Can memory be owned, identity rewritten, and a man made eternal through the minds of others? The answer, as the valley would show, was far more terrifying than anyone imagined. By 1873, the scale of Harrow's work had surpassed anything anyone outside Ashford Hollow could comprehend. The children, now teenagers, acted with chilling precision. They moved like instruments in a symphony only Harrow could hear, their actions coordinated, as if one mind guided them all. Adults, weakened by fear and years of psychological strain, became little more than observers, witnesses to the slow erasure of ordinary life. Harrow himself had become almost spectral in presence. He no longer mingled unnecessarily. Instead, he monitored from the shadows, studying behavior, noting deviations, and refining his methods. His obsession had shifted from mere replication to perfection. Each child, each mind, was an experiment in longevity, obedience, and cognitive molding. If one faltered, Harrow recorded every detail with meticulous care, adjusting stimuli and repeating procedures until compliance was flawless. But anomalies persisted. Samuel occasionally resisted for a brief moment, refusing to answer when prompted, staring into the distance with a flicker of memory that did not belong to Harrow. Miriam hummed unfamiliar melodies late at night, melodies that seemed to carry fragments of life outside the hollow. These small signs, though fleeting, hinted at the irrepressible nature of human identity. Memory could be overwritten, but perhaps it could never be completely erased. Rumors outside the valley continued to circulate, though they were often dismissed as folklore. Stories of children with unnatural knowledge, adults moving with mechanical precision, and a doctor who defied mortality traveled among nearby towns. Travelers who dared approach described seeing figures in the fog, moving in unnatural synchrony, their eyes eerily still. Those who stayed too long reported headaches, disorientation, and a gnawing sense that the hollow was alive, aware, and watching. Harrow, however, was undeterred. He saw in these anomalies opportunities. Each flicker of resistance became a test of his methods, a chance to refine his technique. He began documenting ways to integrate fragments of rebellion into controlled experiments, theorizing that even independent thought could be harnessed to serve his greater design. The hollow, in his mind, was a crucible. By now, the valley had become both sanctuary and prison. It was a place where memory, identity, and humanity were tools, not rights. And yet, despite the meticulous control, one truth remained unaltered. No matter how thoroughly Harrow imposed his will, the human mind retained slivers of its own, stubborn and untouchable, waiting for the moment to reassert itself. By 1874, Ashford Hollow had become a silent empire of memory and obedience, a place where time seemed to bend under the weight of Harrow's influence. Children, now fully grown in body but still vessels of his mind, moved with unerring precision. They spoke in languages they had never learned, corrected adults with the certainty of their creator, and performed tasks without hesitation. The town itself had become a living laboratory, every street, home, and field a stage for the continuous experiment. But cracks persisted, subtle yet undeniable. Samuel's brief flashes of autonomy grew slightly longer. Miriam's melodies shifted in unexpected patterns. Even adults whispered behind closed doors, exchanging fragments of forbidden knowledge, daring to hope that identity could resist. Harrow noticed these irregularities, noting them in his journals with clinical curiosity rather than alarm. Each fragment of independence became a test, a measure of how far the human mind could bend before snapping or breaking. Outside Ashford Hollow, the valley was a ghost story, a caution whispered in nearby towns. Travelers avoided the fog-covered ridges, convinced that children watched from hidden corners, that adults moved unnaturally, that the hollow itself was sentient. Occasionally a stranger would vanish, reappearing days later with an eerie calm or unrecognizable expressions. Some claimed their memories had shifted, small details erased, new thoughts implanted, as if the hollow had reached beyond its borders. Inside the valley, Harrow's ambition remained boundless. He was no longer simply replicating himself through memory. He sought perfection, a continuity of consciousness that could survive death. Each mind under his control was a vessel for fragments of his identity, a network of thought that extended across generations. He believed he could achieve immortality, not through the body, but through the preservation of will and intellect in others. Yet despite decades of meticulous planning, Ashford Hollow remained imperfect. Resistance, though rare and subtle, persisted. The human mind, it seemed, could never be fully tamed. Fragments of memory, flashes of individuality, small bursts of emotion, they survived the years of manipulation. And these tiny sparks, though almost invisible, carried the potential for something far greater than Harrow intended. As the sun set behind the misty hills, the valley appeared calm, almost serene. But beneath that stillness, a quiet tension hummed. Ashford Hollow had become a place where humanity itself was tested, reshaped and redefined. And the question lingered, unspoken yet unavoidable. If memory can be rewritten, and identity bent, what remains of the soul? By 1875, Ashford Hollow had entered its final stage. The valley appeared ordinary to outsiders, misty fields, a church steeple, and homes scattered along quiet lanes. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, the hollow had become a monument to Harrow's obsession. Children, now young adults, moved in perfect synchrony, their eyes reflecting a knowledge that was not their own, their thoughts and actions indistinguishable from the mind of the man who had molded them. Even Samuel, once the boy who had claimed to be Harrow, now bore fragments of his creator so deeply embedded that it was impossible to tell where one consciousness ended and the other began. Miriam hummed tunes that contained coded instructions, patterns of thought no outsider could decipher. Every resident, every structure, every heartbeat in the hollow functioned as part of a single living experiment. Harrow had not only survived the decades, through memory, influence and replication, he had become eternal. Yet even in this carefully constructed world, the imperfection of human memory persisted. Small anomalies flickered like shadows, a glance too sharp, a hesitation too long. A memory recalled that should have been erased. It was as if the human mind carried a stubborn spark, fragments of autonomy that could not be fully consumed. For the first time, even Harrow appeared unsettled. He began recording these anomalies with obsessive precision, realizing that perfection was a dream forever out of reach. The valley remained isolated. Outside, observers occasionally glimpsed figures in the mist, children who spoke with the authority of a man decades older, adults who moved like actors, reading from unseen scripts. Travelers who strayed too close spoke of a presence watching, listening, reshaping thought without touch. Some never returned. Those who did were never quite the same. Small pieces of their memory had vanished, leaving gaps no one could explain. And then, in the dead of night, the impossible occurred. A faint whisper echoed across the hollow, seemingly from no one yet everywhere. Samuel, the vessel, turned abruptly and spoke words Harrow himself had never written. Miriam followed, her melody twisting into a tone unrecorded in any journal. One by one, the children began to act in ways unpredictable, unscripted. The hollow trembled, not with fire, not with rebellion, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible reclaiming of what had been stolen. Harrow's notes end abruptly, the final pages missing. No one knows if he witnessed what came next, or if he became just another fragment, lost among the minds he thought he controlled. Ashford Hollow stands today, abandoned, overgrown, its true history buried beneath mist and memory. Yet some say, if you wander close enough, you can hear faint whispers and melodies, voices not entirely human, not entirely one man. And in those whispers lies the question they were never meant to ask. Can a mind truly be owned, or will it always find a way to remember itself?